Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're looking at the effects of protest. Do protests influence what politicians talk about? And what does this say about the role of protests in democracy? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Protest is a fundamental part of democracy, from thousands attending pro-Palestine marches in London, to farmers driving their tractors into Paris, Berlin and Cardiff, to Just Stop Oil spraying UCL's famous portico orange. Protests are rarely out of the spotlight. But what do protests actually achieve? Do they affect political debate and policy outcomes? Well, a new study sheds light on that, focusing on the impact of climate protests here in the UK on what MPs talk about, both in Parliament itself and online. One of the co-authors of that article is Tom Fleming, who is lecturer in British and Comparative Politics here in the UCL Department of Political Science, and also one of my colleagues in the UCL Constitution Unit. Regular listeners may remember Tom's previous appearance on the podcast looking at the role Parliament played in Brexit. And I'm delighted that Tom joins me now. Again, Tom, great to have you back on the podcast. And let's start by looking at what we already know. So what has previous research told us about whether protests affect outcomes?
Hi, Alan. Thanks, and thanks very much for having me back on the podcast. So there has been a large amount of literature looking at whether protests have consequences, the conditions under which they have consequences, and they've looked at a range of outcomes. So previous studies have looked at the effect of protests on public opinion, on voting behaviour, on media coverage, and then the area that's particularly relevant for this paper is work that's looked at how far protests affect legislative politics, so what goes on inside parliaments and congresses around the world. And largely that work has shown that protests can sometimes matter. So they've looked particularly at sort of two kinds of things that go on inside parliaments. So one, they've looked at actual policy change. So there's papers showing that protests on a particular issue can sometimes be followed by an increase in the number of pieces of legislation that are passed which actually address that issue. There's also work looking at issue attention, so the amount of attention that gets paid to the issue that protests want to raise awareness of after those protests inside the Congress or the Parliament. And so people have looked at how many congressional hearings have been held on a particular topic after protests on that topic. So we know from lots of that literature that protest can matter, but we sort of think that literature has a couple of shortcomings which we then want to try and address in this paper. So the first of those is that this work on parliaments often looks at quite sort of aggregated or parliament-level outcomes. So it'll look at things like the number of bills passed in total on an issue, or the number of hearings that were held in total on an issue. But much less work, particularly outside studying the US, looks at the actual behaviour of individual MPs. So not asking whether protests in a country lead to policy changes in a country, but asking whether protests in a particular constituency change what the MP or representative for that area then does. So that's one thing we think would be interesting to explore more. And then the second thing, which is less a shortcoming of the existing literature and more what we see as an area where we can make a new contribution, is that lots of this work focuses predominantly on what MPs actually do inside Parliament. And to an extent, that is entirely understandable. After all, that's the main part of their job. We elect people to go and speak for us in Parliament. But increasingly, MPs also do a lot of very visible things outside Parliament and particularly online. So one of the main ways, in fact, probably, that lots of citizens see what their MP is doing is not by watching Parliament or watching media coverage of Parliament, but it's seeing the MP posting things on various social media sites. And so we think to get a rounded picture of how protest affects what MPs do, it's important to look at both their online and their offline behaviour, which is what we try to do in the paper.
And can you say just a little bit more maybe about why this is interesting? So I guess someone might think that, well, the protesters are trying to achieve policy change, so we should be interested in whether policy change is achieved, what the outcome is, and the mechanisms through which that might happen, that's not so interesting. Why should we actually get into the detail of those mechanisms?
So I think there's at least two reasons. And the first is that we think what MPs say is sort of intrinsically important and interesting. Obviously, policy change matters, and that's one of the main things that parliaments do, but just the way that an issue is discussed or the frequency with which it's discussed seems an important part of shaping what political discourse gives attention to and decides is an important topic worthy of political attention. And we think that's particularly important through the lens of thinking about representation. So we sort of choose our MPs to go to Parliament to speak for us. And so it seemed important to understand what it is they're speaking about, in that that's what they are sort of signalling to the political system are their voters' priorities. And so it seems to matter through that lens. I think it also matters, though, for thinking about policy change, in that policy change often only happens after lots of other things have happened first. And so a sort of necessary precursor is often that the thing actually gets talked about. And so if protesters are interested in achieving policy change, then potentially a first step is actually getting people to talk about the issue that you are trying to raise sort of awareness of, which might then spill over into more discussion, the issue being taken more seriously, people giving more attention to possible solutions, and then eventually to the policy change. It seems that those steps in the middle are important in their own right, and as a way of sort of thinking about the steps that lead us to policy change.
And that connection as well between the local nature of the protests, so the fact that they're happening in a particular constituency and whether that has an impact on the MP for that particular constituency, is maybe something that political science doesn't terribly much focus on, the role of the individual constituency MP. But actually, we have lots of evidence that members of the public really care about that connection with their MP, and MPs themselves care about the connection with their constituents.
Mm-hmm. And lots of the ways that political campaigners, be it those organising protests or those organising sort of letter-writing campaigns, those might target a particular party or a particular minister, but quite often those are framed in the put pressure on your local MP sort of vein. And so directly studying that dynamic and understanding whether that is actually effective in this context seems to be quite an important contribution, especially in contexts that are built around electoral systems where you have an MP for one particular area. Often the defence of those is that it builds some sort of link, representational link between the MP for place X and the people of place X, and that this seems another part of that story of local representation through a local MP.
Yeah. So you're looking at local protests and the impact of local protests upon what politicians from those constituencies say. What particularly were your hypotheses?
Mm-hmm. So we've got two main hypotheses, really. The main one, the first one, is basically that we think protests about a particular issue in a given constituency should increase that constituency's MP's attention to that issue. So if there are protests in North Norfolk about a particular topic, that should make it more likely for the MP for North Norfolk to then talk about that issue. And we think that for a few sort of theoretical reasons. The first being our starting assumption is that MPs want to get re-elected. They clearly have lots of other motives. They want to achieve policy and do good things and stand up for the people of their area and so on. But getting re-elected is a sort of necessary precondition to doing all of those, at least in the medium and long term. So our assumption is that to some extent, MPs want to respond and show that they are kind of taking seriously the concerns of their area. And in a sense, that sort of is quite core to the whole sort of rationale for democracy in a way. We elect people on the assumption that they will then pay attention to those who elected them, in part to make sure they get re-elected next time. And we think that protests might be seen by MPs as a kind of signal of their constituents' views. And so there's lots of ways MPs might sort of get a picture of what their constituents care about, either the people who come to their constituency surgery or the people they happen to talk to when they're out canvassing. And protests might be one more source of information. That's particularly true because sort of going out and protesting isn't cost-free. At a minimum, it sort of takes up time. There are other things you could be doing rather than going on a protest. But at a sort of more extreme level, sometimes protests incur particular costs to people in terms of, if they're heavily policed or if there's sort of crackdowns and people see sanctions for going on protests. That's not particularly true in this case, but more generally, if protesting is sort of costly, even in some minimal way, it signals that you care about an issue, and people don't go and protest about things they don't care about very much. So it signals to the MP, this is something my voters care about. That's
interesting. Can I just interrupt you there? Because something I often say to my students when they're writing their essays is do not use the fact that there has been a protest on something as evidence of the state of public opinion on that thing, because it's only a tiny minority of the people who are ever taking part in the protest. I mean, would politicians really make that kind of equation? Mm-hmm. I guess the hunch that I would have had would be more that politicians are seeing, well, this is what some of my constituents think, and it's important for me to signal to those constituents that I'm aligned with their view. And in a sense, those people are the ones who are likely to notice that I'm doing that signal, whereas people who have a different view are not likely to notice that I'm doing that signal, and therefore it's fine for me to kind of communicate in this way in response to the protest.
I think that's true, although they could well, given that the sorts of responses we're thinking about are public, it could well be the case that signalling responsiveness to one group does actually have costs in terms of your popularity with another group. If there's a divisive local issue and there's a protest and you side with one side, the other lot are going to notice, I think. So I think it possibly is fair enough to think that actually what's going on here is signalling to a particular subset of your voters. But we also still think it's plausible to think that MPs might see this as so in this case we look at climate protests, we might think that this is showing more voters than I thought in my constituency care about the climate.
So the MPs just mostly haven't been to our seminars at UCL, and therefore they haven't got the idea that these protests are not useful sources of information.
They haven't, and that's true. But I suppose I'd say two things. One is that we know from various other research that actually MPs aren't particularly good at accurately estimating what their voters care about, and they pick up different signals, and they don't always have a particularly clear sense or accurate sense of what actually the priorities and opinions of their voters are.
And I guess it's hard. So you
exactly.
are perfectly legitimate to pick up such signals as do exist. I mean, I'm saying to my students, well, look at opinion polling data. That's a more reliable indicator of public opinion. But MPs don't have that at the constituency.
Well, exactly. And we also think that at least by going on a protest, you are showing that you're sort of politically mobilised and interested. And so those who go on protests, an MP might well think, are quite likely to be voting at the next election, which a large number of their constituents might well not be. And they're also potentially people who might well sort of inform the views of others. They could be a politically active and politically influential group of their constituents. And so it's plausible that whether or not we think that's true, that MPs might think that this is a group worth listening to as a signal of wider opinion in the area.
Yeah. So you were telling us about your hypotheses, and I interrupted you when you were halfway through. So second hypothesis?
Yes, and just to finish on the first, I guess we're saying, when we're saying they might respond to that, I guess we're saying that by talking about the issue, that's a form of responsiveness, that they expect if they talk about it in Parliament or they talk about it online on social media, their voters or some set of their voters will notice, and that will be viewed positively. But the second hypothesis is that we think MPs' responsiveness should actually differ between offline speech, by which we mean speeches in the House of Commons, and online speech, by which we mean posts on social media. In this case, what was then called Twitter is now called X. The reason for that is partly because we think they're sort of differently constrained, and partly we think there's different audiences. So to start with the constraints, MPs can post on Twitter when they like, as much as they like. They don't really have to prioritise particularly. And indeed, some of that's going to be done by their staff, so it's not even them themselves posting the stuff. By contrast, Parliament isn't always sitting. When it is sitting, the agenda is structured such that only certain topics are actually up for debate each day. MPs aren't guaranteed a slot when they do want to speak, and when they do get to speak, they're going to have to choose which of the many topics they care about to prioritise. So there's lots of reasons why we just think it's easier for them to potentially respond, particularly in a quick way, online than it is in Parliament. And so we expect that should mean that we see this effect more strongly in the online speech than offline speech. And then the second thing would be that there are different audiences in that and this a bit comes back to what you were saying earlier about sort of picking out particular groups of voters to try and appeal to. Our hunch is that those who pick up the signals from what you're doing in Parliament, it's much more mediated. Almost no one's watching Parliament directly. Some people are picking it up from the media, some people from MP's own publicity. But the people who follow an MP online are very likely to be a sort of self-selecting group of people who are sympathetic to your aims, probably more politically attentive than other voters. And so again, there might be sort of more bang for your buck by signalling to the people online that this is an issue you're responding to and that you're taking their concerns seriously. So for those reasons, we expect MPs to talk about an issue more in both of those arenas, but we expect the effect to be particularly strong online rather than offline.
Good. So we've got the question, we've got the hypotheses. How do you go about testing the hypotheses?
So we put together data from between 2017 and 2019 on when protests occurred, a particular type of protest, and what MPs talked about. So to start with the protests, we looked particularly at the Fridays for Future protests, which were a climate-based set of school strikes, inspired initially by Greta Thunberg, where on sort of certain Fridays, secondary school and primary school children would leave school. Often this was also an umbrella organisation bringing in lots of other climate groups, but these would be protests during the day on a Friday to raise awareness of the climate and to particularly inspire more sort of urgent action on tackling climate change. And so we've got a data set of basically all of the Fridays for future protests that occurred between 2017 and 2019. And we also know when they occurred down to the day, and we also know where they occurred, so we can match them to individual constituencies. And then we pair that with a data set that basically counts on each day how many times MPs either tweeted about climate change or spoke in Parliament about climate change.
And that is underpinned by all sorts of very whizzy analysis of the. So you scrape the data from Twitter and you scrape the data from Hansard, the Parliament website, and you get all of the text from these, and then you do some very fancy stuff in order to identify what is actually focused on the climate issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, the short version is that we create a list of words that we think indicate attention to climate change and to associated issues. So things like climate change, climate breakdown, environmental rights, and then we count the number of tweets or speeches from each MP each day that include one or more of those phrases. So we do that. One way of doing that would have just been to come up with the list ourselves, to sit down and think what words sort of signal climate change attention, and then to look for those words. We did it in a slightly more automated way, in that we used something called word embeddings, which is basically where you take a body of text, you identify words within that text which are used in similar ways, and that therefore we might expect to have similar meanings. So we applied that method to all of this text we're analysing, and we took all of those tweets, and then we used that to identify a set of words that we think have a similar meaning to climate. And so this threw up words like nature, emissions, pollution, environmental. Obviously, some of those won't always be used in the sort of context we're talking about. So people might talk about, the nature of political debate has got worse, or so on. So we then went through that manually to identify the most common phrases which seem to have the obviously relevant kind of connections to the topic we're talking about. So then this threw out things like climate change, climate crisis, environmental justice, and so on. So armed with that list, we were then able to go through all the speeches and tweets and basically say, do you include one or more of these phrases? And if it did, we counted that as a climate-related speech or a climate-related tweet.
Fantastic. So the most important question, what did you find?
So we found partial support for our expectations. So we did find an effect on MPs tweeting. We found that on the day of these protests in a constituency, an MP was more likely to tweet about climate change, or that they posted on average more tweets about climate change. So we found that effect when we looked at MPs' behaviour online. But we didn't find an effect for MPs' behaviour in Parliament. We didn't find it when we just looked at their actual speeches. And this was even true when we did various things to try and reflect the fact that offline speech in Parliament is just different from tweeting online, partly due to the sort of constraints I already talked about earlier. So, for example, we looked at sort of effects over a longer window, like the next week, or we looked at the effects on the next sitting day in case Parliament just wasn't sitting after the protest. And that's particularly important given that Parliament rarely sits on, or it doesn't always sit on Fridays, and many MPs don't show up, and it doesn't sit over the weekends, and so there's just a longer time from these Friday-focused protests until there's an opportunity for them to speak. So even when we did those various things, we just couldn't find any effect on what they were doing in Parliament, but we found some, admittedly small effect, on what they were doing online on social media. So this sort of fitted with our expectations to the extent we did find more responsiveness online than offline, but it was different from our expectations in that we did expect still some responsiveness offline and didn't find any. So that gap was larger than we expected, to the extent that we just didn't find that offline responsiveness.
Any thoughts on why?
So I suppose parts of them are already contained in that initial expectation. I suppose we already had reasons why we thought that online tweets in some way do represent an easier way to quickly signal responsiveness to an issue rather than waiting for your scarce parliamentary time to come up at some point in the future. So I think it's partly due to that, partly due to the different audiences, again, that we mentioned. And another thing could be due to the particular time period we're looking at, 2017 to 2019. Listeners might remember that Parliament largely discussed one topic in that time period. They did talk about lots of other things when they had a chance, but Brexit clearly dominated that period, and there was an awful lot of polarisation within Parliament, an awful lot of discussion of Brexit on the agenda in various forms. And so it's possible that sort of this is crowding out the space in Parliament to raise those other issues. So it could partly also be a function of that. And we also think, in a way, there might be a degree of sort of substitution between these two things, in the sense that if you've signalled your responsiveness to these protests online, then you've sort of done it, and that doing it again in Parliament is perhaps not actually necessary. And so maybe there's, in a sense, a division of labour between the sorts of things MPs are doing online and the sorts of things they're doing offline in Parliament.
And what's the implication of this? Should the people who took part in these protests think that, gosh, it actually wasn't worthwhile at all? Because, I mean, the MP might have put out a quick tweet, but, that doesn't change anything. Mm-hmm. What is really important is what happens in Parliament. And if there was no impact that took place in Parliament itself, does that mean that these protests just didn't really do anything?
Mm-hmm. So I think there's two versions of that answer. One is, of an answer to that question, rather. One would be that I still think what we find shows some effect. So, this does signal at least... and in a way that makes us quite sure that what we're finding is a sort of causal effect, that we can be sure this is what's really going on. We do seem to find evidence that MPs' tweets do, to some extent, respond to these protests. So that's the sort of positive story. But looking at it from the other end, I suppose, the fact we don't find the sort of particular effects we were looking to find in MPs' parliamentary speech doesn't mean that protests, or even that these protests, didn't have useful or their intended consequences. That's in part because protests have lots and lots of intended goals, and they'll vary. So they might want to, just as I said earlier, that MP's speech might be a necessary kind of precursor to policy change. It might actually be that public opinion is also an intervening step. And so maybe these are about influencing public opinion or influencing media coverage or, or even sort of they serve as a focal point for mobilising and organising the actual group themselves. And by organising protests, it's a way of building your own membership. So there's lots of other goals or outcomes of protest, which we don't study here, which it's perfectly plausible they might still have had some impact on. And there's also, even thinking about the outcome we were talking about, which was how often do they talk about climate in Parliament or online, even though we don't find the MP level relationship between a protest in a constituency and the MP for that constituency, it's perfectly possible that at a sort of national level, these waves of protest, and there were lots of these protests, particularly in 2019, it's perfectly possible that they did, as a sort of national level, shift the discourse. And we do, in some other analyses in the paper, find some evidence that across this period, MPs did start to talk about climate change more, and they did start to talk about it in different ways. It became more tightly associated with words that imply sort of urgency or emergency or crisis. That evidence doesn't really let us pin down the sort of causal relationship between the two things, but it does at least suggest some plausibility to the idea that there was a shift in this period in line with what those protests were trying to achieve. And so in that sense, I think there are plenty of other ways the protests could matter, despite the ways in which we show they didn't matter.
That's really interesting because there's lots of debate in political science around causal identification and the desirability of being able to prove the causal effects of different things. But often causal effects are quite difficult to demonstrate. And I guess in a sense you've focused in the paper on one effect, one possible effect that is easy to identify causally if it exists, because you're looking at the individual MP level and there are lots and lots of individual MPs, so you can have a nice big sample size and you can see whether there's an effect at that level. But in many ways, the most important effect is the overall effect on the discourse and the policy environment and the discussion and so on. So I was quite struck when I was reading through the paper that there was evidence of quite a significant shift in the amount of discussion of this issue, and the fact that people were using phrases like climate emergency much more often by the end of the period than they were at the start of the period. And I suppose, it would be kind of surprising if that sort of shift happened over a 2-year period, spontaneously, without something causing it. Yeah. And we know that these protesters and lots of other protesters are talking about climate emergency and using that kind of framing. So it would be kind of a bit surprising if there were no causal effect there, but it's not the mere fact of it being surprising isn't enough for political scientists to be happy that they found something.
I suppose that's why I said slightly hedge with that word. It seems plausible that this could have been the case. And I guess you're right, it seems unlikely it happened by coincidence. But I suppose there's also other things going on as well, other protests or other sort of changes in international opinion or things going on in other parliaments that we might think could also be impacting this. I look at this and think, I'm reasonably convinced that those protests had some impact on what MPs were saying and how they were saying it. But in terms of being able to sort of rule out other explanations, then it's much harder. But I guess I wouldn't want to characterise the MP level stuff as looking at a less interesting or important bit of the story because it's easier to sort of get a causally identified empirical analysis. I don't think that was the goal. I think we thought the thing we were looking at here was genuinely substantively interesting. Like, it's important to understand about this constituency level relationship. Clearly, the big picture is how that all adds up into a national level story, but this wasn't a kind of choice motivated by methodological needs. It was motivated by thinking that was an interesting question.
Yes, no, absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. I didn't mean to suggest that at all. So just thinking about that implication then, and that focus on the individual level, to what extent are the findings that you get here likely to be generalizable? Mm-hmm. And you mentioned earlier on that the electoral system in the UK might be a factor here, in that individual MPs represent individual constituencies, and therefore the local mechanism might be particularly important. Yeah. But presumably there are other factors here that might shape what we think about generalizability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, another way of doing this study would have been to look at lots of different types of protest and then see if the effects differed across those. But because we only studied the Fridays for Future protests, what we can do is sort of speculate in an informed way about how these protests or the context differ from other protests, and think about how that might change things. And we did view this as a sort of what political scientists sometimes might call a most likely case, in that we thought actually this was a scenario where it seemed pretty plausible that if protests were going to matter, they would matter. And so to the extent we don't find anything, that sort of does raise questions about whether this would show up elsewhere.
And just explain a bit why you thought this was the most likely case.
Yeah, so a couple of things. You've mentioned the electoral system, and this, from various research, we know that the UK's electoral system is one that encourages MPs to think about local opinion, however they end up perceiving it. A couple of other things are due to the nature of this issue and the nature of the protesters. So to take the nature of the issue, climate change, at least in the period we were studying here, was, we think, broadly an area of rough consensus between the main parties. The competition seemed to largely be about sort of who would do more on this issue. There was a consensus that reducing emissions and so on would be a desirable goal, and that there was largely discussion and debate about how to achieve that goal or how fast to achieve that goal and so on. So it wasn't politicised in that way as much. And I think that would make it easier for individual MPs to respond to protests, because it wouldn't mean they faced the choice of sort of conflicting with their party line on the issue. There's sort of more space for that, perhaps. That might be a bit less true now. The environment's clearly become a lot more politicised as an issue in the UK recently, and it's a bit harder to see it, I think, as an area of that sort of consensus. So that might have already changed, I think. And then the second thing is really about the features of the protesters themselves and their methods, in that this was largely, particularly in the way it was organised, even if not in terms of all the people who came, this was largely school children. This was initially badged as school strikes. And so it might be that this is just a group of protesters that are either kind of more appealing or more sympathetic to people, or at least harder to demonise or to dismiss, that perhaps they are in some ways simply a more effective group of people protesting, simply even maybe because it's just quite an unusual sight to see school children protesting, that we think compared to some other groups, that maybe this is just a group whose protests are particularly likely to have a voice, which I guess does slightly conflict with the kind of other things we know about politics, about how the voices of young people tend to sometimes carry less weight than older people. But in this particular case, I think it seems plausible that school children are a harder group to kind of vilify. And
particularly, I guess, at the local level. Mm-hmm. So thinking about that local mechanism being the focus here again, you would expect an MP to want to be positive about the local school children in their constituency. Mm-hmm. Whereas, I was thinking, had you done this on Just Stop Oil protests, you wouldn't think that someone chucking soup at a painting in the National Gallery would particularly get attention from the MP for the cities of London and Westminster. Yeah. That's not the point. It's not a locally focused protest.
Yes.
Whereas school protests, in a kind of a way, they are much more locally focused, because they're very, very local people.
Yeah.
And again, that connection with the MP seems to matter more there.
Absolutely, and also the fact they're on Fridays, which is the day when not all MPs, but lots of MPs will have gone back to their constituencies already. So there's a greater chance of them actually having seen this protest, perhaps. Obviously, constituencies are quite big, but there's a good chance that they will have heard about, or maybe we know that in some cases went and attended. And so signalling, their solidarity with the children of X or Y high school in their constituency might well be a sort of more electorally attractive offer than some of the things you just touched on.
Yeah. So this is a most likely case to find an impact of protest upon MP behaviour.
Or at least we think it is. We can only that's our kind of theoretically informed speculation, yeah.
Yeah. and yet you don't find terribly much effect.
Yeah.
So what do we conclude from that? Do we conclude that, it looks like maybe protests don't have this, or through this mechanism at least, they don't have much effect?
I think we could conclude that, or we conclude we were wrong and that maybe there are other cases that would actually see a bigger effect for reasons we've not thought about. Or it could simply be, an alternative that we don't really discuss very much in the paper, is that perhaps if there is just this big national level shift going on, then the sort of scope for the individual level relationship to matter is a bit reduced. If there's a time where a wave of protests is seeing a wave of change in how MPs speak, then we would just expect that constituency to MP relationship to be a bit attenuated.
So if you had an opportunity to do more research in this area in order to explore it further, what might you focus on?
Well, I suppose we've just been talking about that key question of, well, we've studied this particular case, these particular protests. What does that tell us about other protests? And it is a limitation in that we've answered the question we set out to answer, but it is a bit hard for us to know whether this really was a kind of most likely case or whether this would travel. And so it might be interesting to repeat, using the same time period and the same sort of context, to look at other types of protest, either because they look at different issues or they use different methods or they have different sort of types of participant, and then more directly, rather than speculating about the likely differences between different types of protest, to sort of more directly study those and compare the differences across them within one study.
Well, I know you're a very busy person and you're working on other things just at the moment, but I hope you get onto it at some point, because it's really fascinating. Genuinely, it's an interesting area that you've explored here. So thank you so much, Tom, for introducing us to this paper. We have been discussing the paper, Does Protest Influence Political Speech? Evidence from UK Climate Protest 2017 to 2019. It came out last year in the British Journal of Political Science and is co-authored by Christopher Barry, Tom Fleming and Sam Rowan. Now, what we'll be discussing in next week's episode is still ever so slightly up in the air. I think we're going to be looking at what should happen when civilians are harmed during armed conflict, which of course is an incredibly important topic just at the moment. But listen in and you will find out what we're talking about for sure. Remember, to make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode was researched by Alice Hart and produced by Eleanor Kingwell-Banham. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.